Hello, and welcome to another gentle descent into the past. Tonight, we'll open the doors to a world once lost, now rediscovered through quiet storytelling. Perhaps you're lying still beneath the covers, or letting the last hours of the day melt away. Either way, I'm honoured to have you here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Are we continents apart, or just a few time zones away? Both listening as the stars come out. If you enjoy resting to soft-spoken tales and thoughtful history, be sure to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover together. Tonight, we're descending into the shadowy underworld of a 19th century Chinatown, where opium wasn't just a drug, it was the thread that wove together stories of addiction, survival, racism, and the complex web of human desires that shaped early America. This isn't just another history lesson. This is the story of real people whose lives were forever changed by three small words that would echo through San Francisco's streets for decades. Have you pipe? But before we step through those hidden doorways, let me paint you a picture of just how deep this rabbit hole goes. We're talking about a time when addiction knew no boundaries of race or class, when Chinese immigrants faced laws specifically designed to criminalize their very existence, and when the city's most respectable citizens would secretly frequent the same establishments they publicly condemned. The stories I'm about to share with you reveal a San Francisco that most history books prefer to keep buried. In this journey, you'll discover how a single plant transformed an entire neighborhood into America's most notorious district. You'll meet the characters who built this hidden empire, from the shrewd businessmen who saw opportunity in addiction to the desperate souls who found temporary escape in bamboo pipes and oil lamps. Most importantly, you'll understand how the fear and fascination surrounding these opium dens didn't just shape San Francisco's Chinatown, but ignited racial tensions that would influence American immigration policy for generations. What makes this story so compelling isn't just the exotic allure of forbidden substances and secret rooms. It's how these events reveal the uncomfortable truth about human nature, about how we create enemies out of those who are different from us, and how addiction becomes both a personal tragedy and a political weapon. Let me take you back to where it all began. The year was 1848, and James Marshall discovered something glittering in the American River that would change California forever. But while thousands of fortune seekers rushed westward chasing dreams of easy wealth, another group was already making a different kind of journey across the Pacific. Chinese laborers, fleeing poverty and political upheaval in Guangdong province, began arriving in San Francisco Bay aboard crowded ships, carrying little more than hope and the clothes on their backs. Among these immigrants was a man named Toy, though that wasn't his real name. In those days, most Chinese immigrants adopted simpler names that white Americans could pronounce, abandoning their family histories like excess baggage. Toy had been a merchant back in Canton, but here in Gold Mountain, as the Chinese called California, he was just another face in the crowd of laborers willing to work for wages that white miners wouldn't accept. But Toy possessed something that would prove far more valuable than any gold nugget. He understood the art of comfort. Back in China, he had occasionally visited the opium houses that dotted the Pearl River Delta, not as an addict, but as a businessman who recognized opportunity when he saw it. He knew that men far from home, whether they were digging in mountain streams or laying railroad track across impossible terrain, would pay almost anything for a few hours of peace. By 1850, Toy had saved enough money to rent a small basement room on what would later become Grant Avenue. The space was barely large enough for 6 wooden bunks arranged around a central brazier, but it was here that San Francisco's first opium den quietly opened its doors. He hung a simple red lantern outside, nothing more than a coloured piece of glass that cast an eerie glow onto the wooden sidewalk below. To most passers-by, it looked like just another Chinese establishment, but to those who knew what to look for, that red light was an invitation to forget. The ritual was always the same. Customers would descend narrow wooden stairs that creaked under their weight, following the sweet, cloying scent that grew stronger with each step. The air grew thicker, warmer, filled with whispered conversations in half a dozen languages. Our toy would greet each visitor with a subtle nod, no names exchanged, no questions asked. Payment was collected up front, usually in gold dust weighed on a small brass scale that gleamed in the lamplight. Then came the ceremony that would become as familiar as breathing to thousands of San Francisco residents over the next 3 decades. The customer would lie on their side on one of the bunks, head resting on a hard wooden pillow that forced them to face the oil lamp burning in the center of the room. Our toy would prepare the pipe with practiced precision, heating a small ball of black tar over the flame until it bubbled and released its intoxicating vapor. The customer would draw deeply, holding the sweet smoke in their lungs as long as possible, before exhaling slowly, already feeling the weight of the world beginning to lift from their shoulders. What happened next was pure escape. The cramped basement room would fade away, replaced by visions that varied from person to person, but always carried the same promise: relief from the grinding poverty, the backbreaking labor, the loneliness of being thousands of miles from everything familiar. Some saw their families back home. Others experienced elaborate fantasies of wealth and success. Many simply felt a profound sense of peace that had been absent from their lives since arriving in this harsh new world. Word of our toy's establishment spread through the Chinese community like wildfire, but it didn't stop there. San Francisco in the 1850s was a city of desperate men, and desperation knows no racial boundaries. Irish dock workers who spent their days loading cargo ships began making their way down those creaking stairs. German merchants, exhausted by the constant struggle to establish their businesses, discovered that a few hours in our toy's den could wash away weeks of stress. Even some of the city's wealthy elite, men who wore silk top hats and carried gold-headed walking sticks, began appearing at that red-lit doorway after dark. This was when things started to get complicated. As long as opium smoking remained confined to the Chinese community, most white San Franciscans were content to ignore it. After all, what did it matter what these foreign laborers did in their spare time? But when respectable white citizens began frequenting Chinese establishments, when wives started wondering why their husbands came home glassy-eyed and speaking in whispers, the city's moral guardians began to take notice. The first newspaper article appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle in 1854. The headline read, "Oriental Vice Corrupting Our Youth," and the article painted a picture of innocent young Americans being lured into dens of iniquity by crafty Chinese merchants. The reporter, who had clearly never set foot in an opium den himself, described yellow devils who used their heathen potions to enslave white minds and corrupt Christian souls. But here's what that reporter didn't understand, what most of the city's establishment refused to acknowledge. The Chinese weren't corrupting anyone. They were simply providing a service that desperate people desperately wanted. The real corruption, the real tragedy was happening in broad daylight on the city's legitimate streets, where men worked 16-hour days for subsistence wages, where families were torn apart by the pursuit of wealth that remained forever just out of reach, where the promise of the American dream had become a nightmare of endless toil and broken promises. By 1860, there were over 20 opium dens operating in what was becoming known as Chinatown, a 6-block area centered around Grant Avenue and stretching toward the waterfront. Each establishment had its own character, its own clientele, its own unspoken rules. Some catered exclusively to Chinese laborers, offering simple accommodations and basic service. Others, like the Palace of Peaceful Slumber, run by a mysterious woman known only as Madame Liu, attracted a more diverse and affluent crowd. Madame Liu's establishment occupied an entire 3-story building on Dupont Street, now Grant Avenue. The ground floor appeared to be a legitimate tea and spice shop, complete with wooden vases lined with ceramic containers bearing Chinese characters. But customers' barrels filled with exotic herbs and shell, who knew the proper phrase, could be escorted through a hidden door behind the counter and into a world that existed nowhere else in America. The Palace of Peaceful Slumber was opium smoking, elevated to an art form. The rooms were decorated with silk tapestries depicting scenes from Chinese mythology, and the bunks were covered with embroidered cushions that cost more than most workers made in a month. Madame Liu herself was a figure of mystery and fascination. A woman who spoke perfect English and claimed to have been educated in Hong Kong before coming to America for reasons she never discussed. She moved through her establishment like a ghost, appearing at a customer's side just when they needed assistance, vanishing again before they could focus their drug-clouded eyes enough to really see her. But the most remarkable thing about the Palace of Peaceful Slumber wasn't its luxury or its mysterious proprietor. It was the clientele. On any given evening, you might find a Chinese railroad worker lying on a bunk next to a wealthy Irish shipping magnate, both lost in the same narcotic dreams. A German baker might share whispered conversations with a Mexican vaquero, their differences in language and culture dissolved by the universal language of addiction. This mixing of races and classes terrified San Francisco's white establishment more than anything else about the opium trade. It wasn't just that white people were using Chinese drugs. It was that they were doing so alongside Chinese people, as equals, in spaces where the rigid social hierarchies that defined 19th century America simply didn't exist. And that's when the real trouble began. The morning of October 15th, 1865, changed everything. That's when Police Chief Patrick Crowley received a visit that would reshape not just Chinatown, but the entire relationship between Chinese immigrants and American law enforcement for decades to come. The visitor was Theodore Whitman, one of San Francisco's most prominent businessmen, and a man whose shipping empire had made him wealthy beyond imagination. But on this particular morning, Whitman looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. His usually immaculate suit was wrinkled, his eyes were bloodshot, and his hands trembled as he placed a crumpled piece of paper on Crowley's desk. "My son," Whitman whispered, his voice barely audible. "He's been missing for 3 days." The paper was a note, hastily scrawled in what appeared to be his 22-year-old son Robert's handwriting. "Father, don't look for me. I've found peace in the dragon's embrace. The yellow smoke calls, and I must answer." Chief Crowley had seen similar notes before. The dragon's embrace was street slang for opium addiction, and yellow smoke referred both to the color of the burning drug and the race of those who sold it. But this was different. This wasn't some Irish dock worker or German immigrant laborer. This was the son of one of the city's most powerful families, a young man who had attended Harvard and was being groomed to take over his father's business empire. "Where do you think he might be?" Crowley asked, though he already knew the answer. "Chinatown." Whitman spat, the word dripping with venom. "Those Chinese devils have poisoned my boy's mind with their heathen drugs. I want every one of their poison houses raided. I want them all shut down." What Whitman didn't know, what he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge, was that his son's addiction hadn't started in Chinatown. It had begun 2 years earlier when Robert was prescribed laudanum, a liquid opium preparation, after breaking his leg in a riding accident. The family physician, Dr. Harrison Wells, had assured the Whitmans that laudanum was perfectly safe, a miracle medicine that would ease their son's pain and help him heal faster. But laudanum, like all opium-based drugs, was incredibly addictive. As Robert's leg healed, his craving for the drug only grew stronger. When Dr. Wells finally refused to continue prescribing the medicine, Robert began seeking it elsewhere. He tried other physicians, but word had spread through San Francisco's small medical community. No respectable doctor would prescribe laudanum to someone who was clearly dependent on it. That's when Robert discovered that the Chinese had something even better than laudanum. Pure opium, smoked rather than consumed as a liquid, produced a more intense and longer-lasting effect. More importantly, it was available without questions, without judgment, without the disapproving lectures about moral weakness that he received from every white physician he consulted. Robert's first visit to an opium den had been terrifying. He had wandered through Chinatown for hours, too afraid to actually enter any of the establishments he suspected of selling drugs. Finally, as the sun was setting and his withdrawal symptoms were becoming unbearable, he approached a young Chinese man who was sweeping the sidewalk in front of a small shop. "Excuse me," Robert had stammered, his face flushing with embarrassment. "I'm looking for... do you know where I might find some relief?" The young man, whose name was Chen Wei, had immediately understood what Robert was seeking. He had seen dozens of white customers over the past year, all with the same desperate look in their eyes, all speaking in the same coded language of need and shame. "You come with me," Chen Wei had said simply, setting aside his broom and leading Robert through a maze of narrow alleys to a nondescript wooden door marked only with Chinese characters. What Robert found inside changed his life forever. The basement room was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The air was thick and warm, filled with the sweet scent of burning opium and the soft murmur of conversations in Chinese and English. Men of all races lay on wooden bunks, their eyes closed, their faces peaceful, in a way that Robert envied desperately. Chen Wei had led him to an empty bunk and introduced him to the proprietor, an elderly Chinese man named Uncle Fong, who spoke no English but communicated through gestures and expressions that somehow conveyed both kindness and understanding. For the first time since his accident, Robert felt no judgment, no pressure to explain himself or justify his need. The pipe preparation ritual fascinated Robert. Uncle Fong moved with the precision of a master craftsman, heating the small ball of opium over the oil lamp flame until it reached exactly the right consistency, then pressing it into the pipe bowl with a thin metal tool that gleamed in the lamplight. Every movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial, transforming what Robert had been taught to view as a moral failing into something that felt almost sacred. When Robert finally drew on the pipe, the effect was immediate and overwhelming. The physical withdrawal symptoms that had been torturing him for days simply vanished. But more than that, the anxiety, the pressure, the crushing weight of his father's expectations and his own sense of inadequacy all seemed to dissolve into the sweet smoke that filled his lungs. For the next 2 years, Robert had lived a double life. During the day, he attended to his duties at his father's shipping company, playing the role of the dutiful son and heir apparent. But several times each week, as soon as darkness fell over the city, he would make his way to Uncle Fong's establishment and lose himself in opium-induced dreams of a world where he didn't have to be Theodore Whitman's son, where he could simply exist without the burden of living up to impossible expectations. Now, 3 days after Robert had finally abandoned all pretense of his double life and disappeared entirely into Chinatown's smoky underworld, his father sat in Police Chief Crowley's office demanding vengeance against the people who had, in his mind, stolen his son. But Theodore Whitman wasn't the only powerful voice calling for action against the opium trade. Throughout the 1860s, as more and more white San Franciscans discovered the escape that opium offered, a growing chorus of moral reformers, religious leaders, and politicians began painting the Chinese community as a threat to American civilization itself. The Reverend William Spear, who ran the Presbyterian mission to the Chinese, published a series of inflammatory articles in the California Christian Advocate describing opium dens as temples of Satan, where Oriental sorcerers used their devil's incense to corrupt innocent Christian souls. His writings were filled with lurid descriptions of white women who had supposedly been lured into these establishments and emerged as slaves to yellow masters. What made Spear's accusations particularly powerful was that he actually had spent time in Chinatown, unlike most of the critics who wrote about it from a distance. He spoke some Chinese and had visited several opium dens as part of his missionary work, but his religious fervor and racial prejudices colored everything he observed, transforming what were essentially small businesses serving a desperate clientele into something far more sinister and exotic, the reality was much more mundane and much more tragic. Most opium den customers were simply people trying to escape unbearable circumstances. Chinese railroad workers used it to numb the pain of 12-hour days, laying track across the Sierra Nevada mountains in conditions that killed hundreds of their countrymen. Irish immigrants smoked opium to forget the poverty and discrimination that kept them trapped in the city's worst neighborhoods. German and Italian newcomers found in those basement rooms a temporary refuge from the constant struggle to establish themselves in a new country that viewed them with suspicion. Even some women, though far fewer than the moral reformers claimed, found their way to the opium dens. Mary O'Sullivan was one of them. A widow who had arrived from Ireland with 2 young children, she worked 16-hour days taking in laundry to keep her family fed. The work was backbreaking. Her hands were constantly raw from the harsh soap and hot water, and she lived in constant fear that an illness or injury would leave her children homeless. Mary's introduction to opium came through another Irish woman who worked alongside her at one of the city's commercial laundries. "It's not what you think," her friend had whispered during a brief break from their work. "It's not like drinking. You don't lose control. You don't become violent. You just rest. For a few hours, you actually rest." When Mary finally worked up the courage to visit one of the dens, she was surprised to find that she was welcomed without question. The Chinese proprietor, a middle-aged woman known as Aunt Ming, treated her with the same quiet courtesy that she showed all her customers. There were no leering looks, no inappropriate advances, none of the dangers that Mary had been warned about by the moral reformers who had never actually set foot in such an establishment. Instead, Mary found a few hours of peace that had been absent from her life since her husband's death. The constant ache in her back from bending over washtubs disappeared. The anxiety about money, about her children's future, about whether she could continue working as her body grew older and weaker, all of it simply faded away. For the first time in months, she slept deeply, dreamlessly, without the nightmares about eviction notices and empty stomachs that usually haunted her rest. But Mary's story illustrates something that the moral reformers refused to acknowledge. Most people who used opium didn't become the hopeless addicts of popular imagination. Mary visited Aunt Ming's establishment perhaps once every 2 weeks, when the physical and emotional exhaustion of her life became too much to bear. She never missed work, never neglected her children, never lost control of her life the way that alcohol had destroyed so many of her neighbors. The problem was that stories like Mary's didn't fit the narrative that San Francisco's establishment wanted to tell about the opium trade. It was much easier to blame the Chinese for corrupting innocent Americans than to acknowledge that the real corruption lay in an economic system that forced people to work themselves to death just to survive. And so the drumbeat of anti-Chinese sentiment grew louder throughout the 1860s. Newspaper editorials demanded action against the yellow peril that was supposedly poisoning American youth. Politicians discovered that attacking Chinatown was a reliable way to win votes from white constituents who needed someone to blame for their own struggles and disappointments. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything, not just for the opium trade, but for Chinese Americans throughout California and eventually across the entire United States. What happened next would demonstrate how fear and prejudice could transform a public health issue into a tool of racial oppression that would echo through American law and society for generations. But first, we need to meet the man who would become the face of Chinese resistance to these growing attacks, a figure whose story reveals just how complex and morally ambiguous the world of 19th century Chinatown really was. His name was Little Pete, though like most Chinese immigrants, that wasn't the name his parents had given him. Born Fengqing in Guangdong province, he had arrived in San Francisco as a teenager in 1868, with nothing but the clothes on his back and an intelligence that would make him one of the most powerful and controversial figures in the city's history. Little Pete understood something that most Chinese immigrants never grasped. Power in America wasn't just about hard work or moral character. It was about knowing which levers to pull, which palms to grease, and most importantly, which secrets to keep. By the time he was 25, he had transformed himself from a penniless laborer into the unofficial mayor of Chinatown, a man who could make problems disappear with a whispered conversation or a carefully placed envelope full of gold coins. But Pete's rise to power began in the most unlikely place imaginable, serving tea in one of Uncle Fong's opium dens. He had taken the job out of desperation, needing any work that would keep him fed, while he learned to navigate this strange new world. What he discovered in those smoke-filled basement rooms was better than any university education he could have received. Night after night, Pete watched the city's elite stumble down those narrow stairs, their carefully constructed public personas dissolving in the sweet haze of burning opium. He memorized faces, listened to whispered confessions, observed the complex web of relationships that connected San Francisco's most powerful citizens. A shipping magnate would lie on a wooden bunk next to a city councilman, both lost in narcotic dreams, while unconsciously revealing business secrets that Pete filed away for future use. The young man's breakthrough came on a foggy evening in October 1870, when he recognized one of the customers as Judge William Morrison, the same man who had been making inflammatory speeches about the need to rid San Francisco of Chinese vice. Morrison had been calling for mass arrests, demanding that the city's opium dens be shuttered permanently. Yet here he was, paying his silver dollars to Uncle Fong and settling onto a bunk with the practiced ease of a regular customer. Pete approached Morrison's bunk with a fresh pot of tea, moving silently in the way that made him nearly invisible to the drugged customers. As he poured the steaming liquid into a small ceramic cup, Morrison grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "You speak English, boy?" Morrison whispered, his eyes struggling to focus in the dim lamplight. "Little bit," Pete replied, though he spoke English far better than most Chinese immigrants. He had discovered early that white people often revealed more when they thought they weren't being understood. "Good, good," Morrison mumbled, releasing Pete's wrist. "You tell Uncle Fong that Judge Morrison appreciates his discretion. You understand? Discretion is very important for a man in my position." Pete nodded and backed away, but he had heard everything he needed. Within a week, he had arranged a private meeting with Morrison at a small restaurant outside Chinatown. The conversation was brief and businesslike. Pete never explicitly threatened to expose the judge's opium use, but he didn't need to. Morrison understood the implications perfectly. From that day forward, Judge Morrison became one of Chinatown's most unexpected allies. When anti-Chinese legislation came before his court, he found legal technicalities that rendered the laws unenforceable. When police raids were planned, Morrison somehow learned about them in advance and passed warnings through intermediaries. In return, Pete ensured that certain information about the judge's recreational activities never became public knowledge. This was how Little Pete built his empire, not through violence or intimidation, but through the patient accumulation of secrets and the careful cultivation of mutually beneficial relationships. By 1875, he controlled not just the flow of information in Chinatown, but the flow of money as well. Pete had recognized something that escaped most observers of the opium trade. The real profit wasn't in selling drugs to individual customers. The real money was in providing protection, both legal and physical, for the establishments that catered to those customers. Every opium den in Chinatown paid Pete a monthly fee, ostensibly for security services, but actually for his ability to keep the police at bay and ensure that competitors didn't encroach on established territories. But Pete's most brilliant innovation was his understanding of white psychology. He knew that San Francisco's elite would continue to frequent opium dens as long as they felt safe doing so. And safety meant more than just avoiding arrest. It meant maintaining the illusion that their drug use was somehow different from the addiction of common laborers. So Pete created what he called gentlemen's establishments, upscale opium dens that catered exclusively to wealthy white customers. These weren't the cramped basement rooms where Chinese workers sought escape from their daily struggles. These were elaborately decorated parlours with imported furniture, silk wall hangings, and service that rivaled the city's finest hotels. The Crown and Dragon, Pete's flagship establishment, occupied an entire Victorian mansion on the edge of Chinatown. From the outside, it appeared to be a private gentleman's club, complete with a doorman who wore formal evening attire and spoke with a refined English accent. Inside, the main floor featured a library, a dining room that served both Chinese and continental cuisine, and a smoking room where customers could enjoy imported cigars and aged whiskey. But the real business took place on the upper floors, in private suites that Pete had designed specifically for opium smoking. Each room was appointed like a luxury hotel, with Persian carpets, crystal lamps, and beds covered in imported silk. Customers could reserve a suite for an entire evening, complete with personal service from attendants who had been trained to anticipate every need. The Crown and Dragon's clientele read like a directory of San Francisco's most influential citizens. Railroad barons would arrive in private carriages, their drivers instructed to wait in a nearby stable until summoned. Bank presidents would climb the mansion's grand staircase to rooms where they could forget, for a few hours, the crushing pressure of managing other people's fortunes. Even some of the city's most prominent clergy found their way to Pete's establishment, their moral convictions temporarily suspended in favour of chemical escape. What made the Crown and Dragon truly revolutionary was how it transformed the social dynamics of opium use. In the traditional Chinese dens, racial and class differences were temporarily erased by shared addiction. But Pete's upscale establishments reinforced social hierarchies, even while serving the same fundamental need. White customers could maintain their sense of superiority while still indulging in what they publicly condemned as a Chinese vice. This segregation served Pete's purposes perfectly. As long as wealthy white customers felt that their drug use was somehow more refined, more civilized than the habits of Chinese laborers, they were less likely to support aggressive law enforcement efforts that might interfere with their own access to opium. Pete had essentially created a class of powerful allies who had a vested interest in protecting at least some parts of the opium trade. But Pete's success also made him a target. By 1876, his influence in Chinatown had grown so extensive that he was effectively operating a parallel government, collecting taxes from businesses, mediating disputes, and even maintaining his own police force of armed guards who patrolled the neighborhood's streets. This level of autonomy terrified San Francisco's white establishment, who began to see Pete not just as a drug dealer, but as a threat to American sovereignty itself. The man who would become Pete's greatest enemy was Dennis Kearney, an Irish immigrant who had arrived in San Francisco with dreams of prosperity, but had found only disappointment and grinding poverty. Kearney worked as a drayman, hauling cargo from the waterfront to businesses throughout the city, back-breaking labor that barely provided enough income to support his wife and 3 children. Like many working-class white immigrants, Kearney had initially viewed the Chinese with a mixture of curiosity and indifference. They were foreign and exotic, certainly, but they seemed to keep to themselves and didn't directly compete for the kinds of jobs that Irish immigrants typically sought. But as the economic depression of the 1870s deepened, as work became scarcer and wages fell, Kearney began to see the Chinese presence in San Francisco through a different lens. The transformation began on a sweltering August afternoon in 1876, when Kearney was hauling a load of grain sacks to a warehouse near the waterfront. The work was exhausting, and by midday he was drenched in sweat and struggling to keep pace with the younger men who competed for the same jobs. As he paused to catch his breath, he noticed a group of Chinese workers loading cargo onto a nearby ship, with what seemed like effortless efficiency. What infuriated Kearney wasn't just that the Chinese workers appeared to be handling their tasks more easily than he was managing his. It was the realization that they were probably being paid less than half of what he earned for the same work, which meant that employers had every incentive to replace Irish workers with Chinese ones. The economic logic was inescapable and terrifying. In a city where survival depended on daily wages, the Chinese represented an existential threat to every white working man. That evening, Kearney made his way to Murphy's Tavern, a cramped, smoky establishment where Irish dock workers and teamsters gathered to drink away the frustrations of another brutal day. The conversation, as it often did, turned to the economic struggles that seemed to define their lives. Jobs were becoming scarcer, wages were falling, and the cost of rent and food continued to climb. "It's those damn Chinese," declared Mickey Sullivan, a stevedore who had been laid off the previous week when his employer hired a crew of Chinese workers at half the usual rate. "They're taking our jobs, driving down our wages, and the bosses love it because they can pay them practically nothing." Kearney listened to the complaints with growing anger, but his fury wasn't directed solely at the Chinese workers. He understood that they were simply trying to survive, just as he was. What enraged him was the system that pitted working people against each other, while the wealthy merchants and factory owners profited from the competition. But as he looked around the tavern at the faces of his fellow immigrants, he realized that complex economic analysis wasn't what they needed to hear. "You're right about the Chinese," Kearney said, his voice carrying the authority of a natural orator. "But it's not just about jobs. It's about what they represent. They come here with their foreign ways, their heathen religion, their opium dens that corrupt our children. They don't want to become Americans. They want to turn America into China." The words felt strange in his mouth because Kearney didn't entirely believe them. He had met individual Chinese workers who seemed no different from Irish or German immigrants, people simply trying to build better lives for their families. But he had discovered something powerful. Fear and resentment could be channeled, focused, weaponized in ways that served political purposes. Over the following months, Kearney refined his message, developing a rhetorical style that combined legitimate economic grievances with racial fears and moral panic. He began speaking at street corners and in public parks, drawing increasingly large crowds of working-class white men who found in his words an explanation for their struggles and a target for their anger. "The Chinese must go," became Kearney's rallying cry. But his speeches went far beyond simple immigration policy. He painted elaborate pictures of Chinese conspiracies, describing opium dens as recruitment centers where innocent white Americans were converted into slaves of Oriental masters. He claimed that Chinese merchants were part of an international network designed to undermine American civilization from within. But Kearney's most effective weapon was his ability to connect the opium trade to the city's broader social and economic problems. When a factory worker lost his job, Kearney explained that it was because Chinese competition had driven wages so low that honest Americans couldn't survive. When a family was evicted from their home, he argued that Chinese landlords were buying up property to create more space for their vice operations. When a young man disappeared into addiction, Kearney blamed Chinese drug dealers who had deliberately targeted vulnerable Americans. The genius of this approach was that it contained just enough truth to be believable, while distorting the larger picture beyond recognition. Chinese immigrants did work for lower wages, but that was because they were systematically excluded from higher-paying jobs and had no choice but to accept whatever employment they could find. Some Chinese businesses did buy real estate in Chinatown, but they did so because they were legally prohibited from purchasing property in most other parts of the city. Chinese merchants did operate opium dens, but their customers were overwhelmingly people who sought out these establishments voluntarily. By 1877, Kearney's speeches were drawing crowds of thousands, and his Working Men's Party had become a significant political force in California. His rallies took on the atmosphere of religious revivals, with participants chanting anti-Chinese slogans and pledging to drive the yellow peril from American shores. The movement's symbol was a large wooden cross that supporters carried through the streets of San Francisco, representing their crusade to save Christian civilization from heathen corruption. The irony, which Kearney himself understood perfectly, was that many of his most enthusiastic supporters were themselves customers of the very opium dens they condemned. Murphy's Tavern, where the movement had been born, was located just 3 blocks from Uncle Fong's establishment, and several of the Irish workers who cheered Kearney's speeches had spent evenings lying on Uncle Fong's wooden bunks. But this contradiction didn't weaken the movement. If anything, it strengthened it by providing participants with a way to externalize their shame and self-loathing. By blaming the Chinese for their own addiction, white opium users could maintain their sense of moral superiority while continuing to pursue the chemical escape they craved. Little Pete watched these developments with growing concern, but also with the calculating mind that had made him successful. He understood that Kearney's movement represented an existential threat to his business empire, but he also saw opportunities. Political upheaval created demand for his services among nervous Chinese merchants who needed protection, and racial tensions made his white customers even more dependent on his ability to provide them with safe, discreet access to opium. Pete's response was characteristically subtle and multifaceted. On one level, he began organizing Chinese resistance to Kearney's movement, funding legal challenges to discriminatory laws, and hiring bodyguards to protect prominent Chinese merchants from vigilante attacks. But simultaneously, he expanded his network of relationships with white politicians and business leaders, using a combination of financial incentives and carefully managed information to ensure that he retained influential allies, even as anti-Chinese sentiment grew stronger. The Crown and Dragon became more important than ever during this period, serving as neutral ground where Pete could maintain relationships with white customers who might publicly support Kearney's movement while privately depending on Chinese-controlled services. The mansion's elegant parlors hosted conversations that would have been impossible anywhere else in the city. As railroad executives who employed Chinese workers at below-market wages socialized with the same politicians who gave speeches about the Yellow Peril, these gatherings revealed the fundamental hypocrisy at the heart of San Francisco's anti-Chinese movement. The same business leaders who publicly supported immigration restrictions privately depended on Chinese labor to maintain their profit margins. The same politicians who gave inflammatory speeches about Oriental vice privately enjoyed the services that Chinese entrepreneurs provided. The same moral reformers who condemned opium smoking as a threat to Christian civilization privately struggled with their own addictions to alcohol and laudanum. But Pete also understood that his position, however lucrative in the short term, was ultimately unsustainable. The political winds were shifting in ways that threatened not just his business interests, but the entire Chinese community in San Francisco. What he needed was a way to demonstrate that Chinese immigrants were not the foreign threat that Kearney portrayed, but valuable members of American society who deserved protection under American law. His opportunity came from an unexpected source, the same federal government that Chinese immigrants had learned to view with suspicion and fear. In 1878, a congressional committee arrived in San Francisco to investigate the Chinese question and determine whether new federal legislation was needed to address what many politicians saw as California's immigration crisis. The committee's hearings were supposed to be an objective fact-finding mission, but everyone involved understood that the real purpose was to provide political cover for anti-Chinese legislation that had already been drafted in Washington. The witnesses were carefully selected to present a predetermined narrative. Chinese immigrants were unassimilable foreigners who threatened American wages, American morals, and American civilization itself. But Pete saw something that other observers missed. The committee members were politicians, and politicians could be influenced by the same methods that had proven so effective with local officials. More importantly, the hearings were being conducted in public, which meant that Chinese Americans would have an opportunity to present their side of the story to a national audience. What happened next would determine not just the fate of San Francisco's opium trade, but the future of Chinese immigration to America for the next 60 years. The committee chairman was Senator Aaron Sargent, a man whose political career had been built on promises to protect California from what he called the Mongol invasion. Sargent had never actually visited Chinatown, had never spoken to a Chinese immigrant, had never witnessed the conditions that drove people to seek escape in opium dens. But he had read the newspaper reports, listened to the speeches of men like Dennis Kearney, and absorbed the racial fears that had become central to California politics. When Sargent gavelled the hearings to order on a cold February morning in 1878, the outcome seemed predetermined. The witness list included Kearney himself, along with a parade of ministers, police officials, and self-proclaimed experts on Chinese vice. Their testimony painted a picture of San Francisco under siege by an alien culture that threatened everything Americans held sacred. Reverend Otis Gibson took the stand first, his black robes lending authority to words dripping with moral outrage. "Gentlemen," he declared, his voice echoing through the packed hearing room, "what we face is not mere immigration, but invasion. These people bring with them practices so vile, so corrupting, that they poison the very air our children breathe." Gibson had spent 2 years as a missionary in China before returning to San Francisco, and his testimony carried the weight of supposed first-hand knowledge. He described opium dens as temples of degradation, where Chinese sorcerers used their devil's smoke to enslave innocent American minds. His most damning claim was that over 3,000 white women had been lured into these establishments and emerged as hopeless slaves to the yellow pipe. The audience gasped at this revelation, though Gibson offered no evidence to support such a specific and inflammatory statistic. But truth had become secondary to theatre in these proceedings, and Gibson understood exactly what his listeners wanted to hear. Police Chief Patrick Crowley followed Gibson to the witness stand, carrying with him a leather satchel filled with what he claimed were opium pipes confiscated during raids on Chinese establishments. He held up each item like a prosecutor presenting evidence of murder, explaining to the committee how these instruments of corruption were used to destroy American youth. "In my 20 years of law enforcement," Crowley testified, "I have never encountered anything so insidious, so calculated to undermine the moral fabric of our society. These Chinese merchants don't just sell drugs, they sell damnation itself." But Crowley's testimony revealed more about his own prejudices than about the reality of Chinatown's opium trade. He spoke of Chinese immigrants as if they were a single, monolithic entity, controlled by some shadowy foreign power. He described their business practices as inherently criminal, their cultural traditions as deliberately threatening to American values. When Senator Sargent asked Crowley to estimate how many white Americans had been corrupted by Chinese opium, the police chief didn't hesitate. "At least 10,000 souls in this city alone, sir, and the number grows every day." Again, no evidence supported this claim, but the committee members nodded gravely and scribbled notes as if they were recording established facts rather than inflammatory speculation. Dennis Kearney's appearance before the committee was the theatrical climax of the hearings. He strode to the witness table with the confidence of a man who knew he was preaching to the converted, his weathered face bearing the scars of countless street fights with Chinese immigrants and their white supporters. "Honourable Senators," Kearney began, his voice carrying the practiced cadences of a veteran agitator. "You ask me about the Chinese question, but there is no question. There is only a clear and present danger to everything we hold dear as Americans." Kearney's testimony was a masterpiece of political manipulation, weaving together legitimate economic grievances with racial fears and moral panic. He spoke of Chinese workers who laboured for starvation wages, driving honest Americans into poverty. He described opium dens as recruitment centres for an international conspiracy designed to weaken American resolve. He painted pictures of Chinese merchants growing wealthy by poisoning American children with their heathen drugs. "They come to our shores not as immigrants seeking freedom," Kearney declared, his fist pounding the witness table for emphasis, but as advanced scouts for an invasion that threatens our very survival as a Christian nation. The audience erupted in applause, and Senator Sargent made no effort to restore order. This was exactly the kind of testimony he had hoped to hear, the kind that would justify the legislation he had already decided to support. But as Kearney spoke, a small group of Chinese men sat in the back of the hearing room, listening to their community being systematically demonized. Among them was little Pete, dressed in an expensive American-style suit and taking careful notes in a leather-bound journal. Unlike the other Chinese observers, who seemed to shrink into their seats as the testimony grew more inflammatory, Pete watched the proceedings with the calculating attention of a general studying enemy troop movements. Pete understood something that escaped most observers. These hearings weren't really about opium or immigration or economic competition. They were about power, about who would control the narrative that defined Chinese Americans in the public imagination. And narratives, Pete had learned, could be shaped by those who understood how to play the game. When the committee announced that it would hear testimony from Chinese immigrants themselves, most observers expected a parade of humble laborers who would apologize for their presence in America and beg for mercy. Instead, Pete had spent weeks carefully selecting witnesses who would challenge every assumption underlying the hearings. The first Chinese witness was Dr. Lai Po Tai, a man whose very existence contradicted the stereotype of Chinese immigrants as ignorant heathens. Dr. Lai had earned his medical degree from Harvard University, spoke perfect English, and had established a thriving practice treating both Chinese and white patients in San Francisco. His testimony began with a simple but devastating question. "Honorable Senators," Dr. Lai said, his voice calm and measured, "I have listened to 3 days of testimony about the supposed evils of my people. I have heard claims about thousands of corrupted Americans, about vast conspiracies, about threats to Christian civilization. But I must ask, where is the evidence?" Senator Sargent shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Dr. Lai, surely you don't deny that opium dens exist in Chinatown?" "I deny nothing that can be proven," Dr. Lai replied. "But I question much that has been assumed. Yes, there are establishments in Chinatown where opium is consumed. But are these the dens of iniquity described by previous witnesses, or are they something else entirely?" Dr. Lai then did something unprecedented in the hearings. He presented actual evidence. From his medical bag, he produced a ledger containing detailed records of his patients over the previous 5 years. The data told a story very different from the one the committee had been hearing. "In 5 years of practice," Dr. Lai testified, "I have treated exactly 47 cases of opium addiction. Of these, 31 were white patients who had become dependent on laudanum prescribed by their physicians. Only 16 were Chinese immigrants, and most of these were occasional users, rather than hopeless addicts." The hearing room fell silent as the implications of this testimony sank in. If Dr. Lai's records were accurate, and there was no reason to doubt them, then the opium crisis in San Francisco was primarily a problem of white addiction to legally prescribed medications, not Chinese corruption of innocent Americans. But Dr. Lai wasn't finished. He produced a second set of records, these documenting the patients he had treated for injuries sustained in anti-Chinese violence over the previous 2 years. The list included broken bones, stab wounds, and burns suffered by Chinese immigrants who had been attacked by white mobs, inflamed by the kind of rhetoric the committee had been hearing for 3 days. "Honorable Senators," Dr. Lai said, his voice carrying a note of quiet anger, "if you wish to discuss threats to public safety, perhaps we should examine who is actually perpetrating violence in our community." Senator Sargent tried to regain control of the narrative. "Dr. Lai, regardless of these statistics, surely you acknowledge that opium use is morally wrong and should be prohibited." Dr. Lai's response was devastating in its simplicity. "Senator, I have read the medical journals published by your finest universities. They describe laudanum as a miracle drug that has relieved more human suffering than any medication in history. The only difference between laudanum and opium is that one is prescribed by white doctors to white patients, while the other is used by Chinese immigrants. If opium is evil, then so is laudanum. If laudanum is medicine, then perhaps we should question our assumptions about opium. The next witness was even more surprising. Mary Chen, a young woman who had been born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrants, but spoke English without any trace of an accent. Mary had attended the University of California and had recently opened a school for Chinese children in Chinatown. Her testimony focused on something the committee had completely ignored: the actual lives of Chinese families in America. "Honorable Senators," Mary began, "you have heard much about Chinese vice and Chinese threats, but nothing about Chinese contributions to American society. Allow me to share some facts that seem to have escaped the attention of previous witnesses." Mary then presented a detailed analysis of Chinese economic activity in San Francisco, complete with tax records and business licenses. The data showed that Chinese immigrants had established over 400 legitimate businesses in the city, employed thousands of workers, both Chinese and white, and paid substantial amounts in local and state taxes. The Chinese community in San Francisco, Mary testified, includes merchants, doctors, teachers, artists, and skilled craftsmen. "We have built schools, hospitals, and temples. We have created jobs and contributed to the city's prosperity. Yet you have heard testimony suggesting that we are nothing but opium dealers and agents of foreign corruption." Senator Sargent interrupted her. "Ms. Chen, do you deny that opium use is a problem in the Chinese community?" "I deny that it is uniquely a Chinese problem," Mary replied firmly. "Opium use exists in every community in San Francisco, among people of every race and social class. But when white Americans use opium or laudanum, it is treated as a medical issue or a personal failing. When Chinese immigrants use the same substance, it becomes evidence of racial degeneracy and foreign conspiracy." Mary's most powerful moment came when she directly addressed the committee's assumptions about Chinese women. Several witnesses had testified that Chinese women were either prostitutes or victims of human trafficking, incapable of making independent decisions about their lives. "I stand before you as living proof that Chinese women can be educated, can contribute to American society, can speak for ourselves rather than being spoken about," Mary declared. "Yet the laws you are considering would treat me as if I were property, as if my race made me inherently inferior to white women who may have less education and fewer accomplishments than I possess." The committee members exchanged uncomfortable glances. They had expected humble apologies and pleas for mercy, not articulate challenges to their fundamental assumptions about Chinese capabilities and character. But Pete's masterstroke was yet to come. His final witness was someone whose testimony would force the committee to confront the hypocrisy at the heart of their proceedings: Judge William Morrison, the same man whose opium use Pete had discovered years earlier. Morrison took the stand reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with his role in Pete's carefully orchestrated performance. But he had no choice. Pete's network of informants had documented Morrison's regular visits to opium dens, and the judge understood that refusing to testify would result in public exposure that would destroy his career. "Your Honor," Senator Sargent began, clearly puzzled by Morrison's presence on the witness list. "What perspective can you offer on the Chinese question?" Morrison cleared his throat nervously. "Senators, I have served on the bench in San Francisco for 15 years. In that time, I have presided over hundreds of cases involving Chinese defendants. I feel compelled to share some observations that may complicate the narrative you have been hearing." What followed was a careful but damning critique of everything the committee had been told. Morrison testified that Chinese immigrants appeared in his courtroom far less frequently than other ethnic groups, that their crimes were typically minor offences rather than violent felonies, and that they showed remarkable respect for American legal institutions despite facing systematic discrimination. In my experience, Morrison said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke, Chinese immigrants are among the most law-abiding residents of this city. They resolve disputes through mediation rather than violence. They honor contracts even when American courts might not enforce them. And they contribute far more to public order than they detract from it. Senator Sargent sensed that the hearing was slipping away from him. Judge Morrison, what about the opium dens? Surely you recognize these as threats to public morality. Morrison paused, and for a moment Pete wondered if the judge would find the courage to tell the complete truth. When Morrison finally spoke, his words were carefully chosen but unmistakably clear. Senator, I have investigated numerous establishments in Chinatown as part of my judicial duties. What I have found are small businesses serving a clientele that includes people of every race and social class. These are not the exotic dens of corruption described by other witnesses. They are simply places where people seek relief from the hardships of life, no different in their essential function from the saloons that operate openly throughout the city. The hearing room erupted in shocked murmurs. A sitting judge had just compared opium dens to saloons, implicitly arguing that Chinese businesses were no more immoral than white-owned establishments that sold alcohol. But Morrison wasn't finished. If this committee is genuinely concerned about threats to public morality and safety, perhaps it should examine the vigilante violence that has claimed dozens of Chinese lives over the past 2 years. Perhaps it should investigate the systematic exclusion of Chinese immigrants from jobs and housing that forces them into marginal occupations. Perhaps it should consider whether the real threat to American values lies not in Chinese immigration, but in our willingness to abandon the principles of equal justice and due process when dealing with people who look different from ourselves. The silence that followed Morrison's testimony was deafening. For the first time in the hearings, someone had suggested that the problem might not be Chinese immigration, but American racism. Senator Sargent quickly adjourned the session, but the damage had been done. The committee's carefully constructed narrative had been shattered by witnesses who refused to play their assigned roles, by evidence that contradicted inflammatory claims, and by testimony that forced uncomfortable questions about American hypocrisy. That evening, Pete hosted a quiet celebration at the Crown and Dragon. The mansion's elegant parlors were filled with an unlikely collection of guests. Chinese merchants who had funded the legal challenge, white allies who had risked their reputations to support Chinese Americans, and even Judge Morrison, who sat in a corner sipping tea and looking like a man who had just survived his own execution. But Pete knew that the battle was far from over. The congressional hearings had been a tactical victory, but the larger war for Chinese acceptance in America was just beginning. The forces arrayed against his community were too powerful, too deeply rooted in American fears and prejudices, to be defeated by a single afternoon of compelling testimony. Indeed, even as Pete's guests celebrated, Dennis Kearney was addressing a rally of 10,000 supporters in Portsmouth Square, his voice carrying across the night air, as he promised that no congressional committee would stop the righteous crusade to drive the Chinese from American shores. "They think they can confuse us with their lies and their tricks," Kearney shouted to the cheering crowd. "They parade their educated Chinese before politicians in Washington, hoping to make us forget the thousands of our people corrupted by their opium, the thousands more thrown out of work by their unfair competition." The crowd's response was thunderous, and Kearney fed off their energy like a man possessed. But we know the truth. We know that every Chinese who remains in America is a threat to our children, our jobs, our way of life, and we will not rest until the last one has returned to the heathen land from which he came. As Kearney spoke, his supporters began lighting torches, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows across faces twisted with hatred and fear. The mob began moving toward Chinatown, their voices rising in a chant that would echo through San Francisco streets for hours. "The Chinese must go. The Chinese must go. Pete stood on the balcony of the Crown and Dragon, watching the torches approach like a river of fire flowing down the city's hills. He had won a battle of words and evidence, but now he faced something far more primitive and dangerous: the raw power of mob violence, fueled by economic desperation and racial hatred. The next few hours would determine whether his careful cultivation of political allies and his network of business relationships could protect his community from the storm that was about to break over Chinatown. More importantly, they would reveal whether American institutions were strong enough to resist the kind of popular hysteria that had destroyed Chinese communities in other Western cities. As the first stones began shattering windows on Grant Avenue and the first screams pierced the night air, Pete made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of fleeing or hiding, he walked down the mansion's grand staircase and out into the street, where he stood directly in the path of the approaching mob. What happened next would become legend in Chinatown, a story passed down through generations as an example of courage in the face of seemingly impossible odds. But it would also mark the beginning of a new phase in the conflict between Chinese immigrants and white Americans, one that would reshape not just San Francisco, but the entire American understanding of race, immigration, and belonging. The mob that surged down Grant Avenue that night was unlike anything San Francisco had seen before. These weren't the organized vigilante groups that had terrorized Chinese miners in the goldfields, or the calculated violence of business competitors trying to eliminate economic rivals. This was something far more primal. Thousands of working-class white men and women who had been convinced that their survival depended on driving every Chinese person from the city. At the front of the crowd marched Dennis Kearney himself, no longer the calculating political organizer who had built the Working Men's Party into a formidable force, but a man possessed by the very hatred he had so carefully cultivated. Behind him came dock workers carrying clubs and lengths of chain, unemployed railroad men wielding pickaxe handles, and women from the Irish and German neighborhoods who had brought their children to witness what they believed would be the salvation of their community. The mob's first target was Uncle Fong's Opium Den, the modest basement establishment where Robert Whitman had first discovered escape from his father's expectations. The elderly proprietor had no warning, no time to flee, as dozens of men poured down his narrow staircase with torches and axes. Uncle Fong stood behind his small counter, his weathered hands trembling as he faced the intruders, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "This is my home," he said in heavily accented English. "I hurt no one. I break no law." His words were lost in the roar of destruction as the mob overturned his wooden bunks, smashed his oil lamps, and set fire to the silk tapestries that had decorated his walls. Uncle Fong himself might have died in the flames, if not for the intervention of an unlikely savior, Mickey Sullivan, the same Irish dock worker who had first complained about Chinese competition in Murphy's Tavern years earlier. Sullivan had been one of Uncle Fong's regular customers for the past 3 years, seeking escape from the same economic pressures that had driven him to join Kearney's movement. As he watched his fellow mob members preparing to beat the old man to death, something in Sullivan's conscience rebelled against the violence he had helped to unleash. "Leave him be!" Sullivan shouted, pushing through the crowd to stand between Uncle Fong and his attackers. "He's just an old man trying to make a living. This isn't what we came here to do." But Sullivan's intervention only enraged the mob further. "Chinese lover!" someone screamed from the back of the crowd. "He's been corrupted by their poison." Within minutes, Sullivan found himself fighting not just to protect Uncle Fong, but to save his own life as the crowd turned on anyone who showed sympathy for the Chinese. The two men, one Irish and one Chinese, stood back to back in the burning basement as dozens of torches closed in around them. They might both have died if not for the arrival of Little Pete and his security force, a carefully selected group of Chinese and white men who had been preparing for this moment for months. Pete had anticipated that his political victories would provoke violent retaliation, and he had quietly assembled what amounted to a private army equipped with modern firearms and trained in urban combat tactics. The gunshots that echoed through Uncle Fong's basement that night marked a turning point in the relationship between Chinese immigrants and white San Francisco. For the first time, Chinese Americans were fighting back with organized force, rather than simply enduring whatever violence was inflicted upon them. Pete's men moved through the smoke and chaos with military precision, using their superior firepower and training to drive the mob back onto the street. But Pete himself had a different objective. Instead of simply repelling the attack, he was hunting for Dennis Kearney, understanding that capturing or killing the mob's leader was the only way to break the cycle of violence that threatened to destroy his community. He found Kearney 3 blocks away, standing in Portsmouth Square and addressing a second wave of supporters who were preparing to join the assault on Chinatown. The labor organizer was in his element, his voice carrying across the crowd as he painted pictures of Chinese treachery and American betrayal. "They think their money and their tricks can save them," Kearney shouted, unaware that Pete was approaching through the crowd. "They think they can buy judges and politicians and make us forget what they've done to our city." Pete moved closer, his hand resting on the revolver concealed beneath his expensive coat. He had killed men before, during the violent struggles that had established his control over Chinatown's underworld. But this would be different. Killing Kearney in front of thousands of witnesses would make Pete a hero to his own people, but a wanted man to the authorities that still controlled San Francisco. But as Pete prepared to draw his weapon, he noticed something that changed his mind. Scattered throughout the crowd were faces he recognized, white customers from the Crown and Dragon and other establishments who had cheered Kearney's speeches while privately depending on Chinese services. Judge Morrison stood near the back of the crowd, his face pale but his presence unmistakable. City Councilman Thomas Bradley, who had taken substantial payments from Pete's organization over the years, nodded along with Kearney's inflammatory rhetoric. In that moment, Pete understood something profound about the nature of the conflict he was fighting. This wasn't really about opium or immigration or economic competition. It was about the fundamental American inability to reconcile public morality with private desires, to acknowledge the gap between stated principles and actual behavior. Instead of shooting Kearney, Pete did something far more devastating. He began taking photographs. Using a new portable camera that he had acquired from a Japanese inventor, Pete systematically documented the faces in the crowd, creating a permanent record of exactly who had participated in the night's violence. The implications were clear to everyone who saw the camera's flash illuminate their features. Pete now possessed evidence that could destroy the reputations and careers of dozens of San Francisco's most prominent citizens. Proof that the same men who publicly supported anti-Chinese violence had privately enriched themselves through business relationships with Chinese immigrants. When Kearney finally noticed Pete standing in the crowd, the two men locked eyes across the square in a moment that seemed to last forever. Each understood exactly what the other represented. Kearney embodied the raw power of popular hatred, while Pete represented the more subtle but ultimately more durable influence of money, information, and carefully cultivated relationships. "There he is!" Kearney suddenly shouted, pointing directly at Pete. "The Yellow Prince himself! The man who has corrupted our judges and bought our politicians!" The crowd began moving toward Pete, but he made no attempt to flee. Instead, he climbed onto a wooden crate and began to speak, his voice carrying the same authority that had made him successful in both legitimate business and criminal enterprises. "Citizens of San Francisco," Pete called out, his English clear and precise despite his Chinese accent. "You have heard many lies tonight about my people and our community. Allow me to offer you some truths that your leaders have chosen not to share." The crowd hesitated, unsure how to respond to this unexpected development. They had come expecting to drive Chinese immigrants from the city through violence and intimidation, not to engage in public debate with one of their supposed enemies. Pete seized the moment of uncertainty to continue his speech. "Mr. Kearney tells you that Chinese workers have stolen your jobs. But who hired those workers? Who decided that Chinese labor was more profitable than white labor? Was it Chinese merchants, or was it the American businessmen who control this city's economy? Murmurs began to ripple through the crowd as Pete's words sank in. He was forcing them to confront an uncomfortable truth. Chinese immigrants hadn't imposed themselves on San Francisco's economy. They had been recruited by white employers seeking to maximize their profits. Mr. Kearney tells you that opium dens corrupt American youth, Pete continued, his voice growing stronger. But who are the customers in these establishments? Are they Chinese immigrants seeking to corrupt Americans? Or are they Americans seeking escape from conditions that your own society has created? Pete then did something that shocked everyone present. He began reading names from a list, identifying specific white San Franciscans who regularly frequented Chinese establishments while publicly supporting anti-Chinese policies. Judge Morrison, Pete called out, do you deny that you have visited Chinese establishments over 40 times in the past 2 years? Morrison's face went white, but he said nothing. Councilman Bradley, do you deny that your construction company employs over 200 Chinese workers at wages below those paid to white laborers? Bradley tried to push through the crowd toward the exit, but Pete's voice followed him. Mr. Sullivan, do you deny that you have sought relief in Chinese establishments even as you marched with Mr. Kearney's supporters? Mickey Sullivan, who was still covered in soot from the fight in Uncle Fong's basement, looked around at his fellow mob members with growing shame. It's true, he said quietly, then louder. It's all true. We're blaming them for things we've done ourselves. The crowd began to fragment as Pete's revelations sank in. Some supporters remained loyal to Kearney, but others started drifting away, confused and ashamed by the contradictions that Pete had exposed. The night that was supposed to end with the destruction of China End, with the complete expulsion of Chinese immigrants from San Francisco, was instead revealing the complex web of hypocrisy that bound the two communities together. But Kearney wasn't finished. As he watched his support crumbling, his rhetoric became even more desperate and inflammatory. Don't let him confuse you with his lies, he screamed, his voice cracking with strain. This is exactly what they do. They use our own weakness against us. They corrupt us with their drugs and then blame us for being corrupted. The Labour leader's words struck a chord with the most committed members of his movement, men who had invested too much of their identity in anti-Chinese hatred to abandon it now. About 200 supporters rallied around Kearney, forming a core of true believers who were immune to Pete's logical arguments. You want to know the truth about Chinese corruption? Kearney shouted, pulling a small object from his coat pocket. Here's the truth. In his hand was an opium pipe, ornately carved and obviously expensive. Kearney held it above his head like a religious relic, and his supporters responded with renewed fury. This belongs to my own brother, Kearney declared, his voice breaking with genuine emotion. Patrick Kearney, a good Irish Catholic boy who worked on the docks until the Chinese destroyed his spirit with their poison. Now he lies in some basement den, lost to his family, lost to his faith, lost to everything decent and American. The crowd fell silent as the full tragedy of Kearney's personal motivation became clear. This wasn't just political opportunism or economic anxiety. Dennis Kearney's crusade against the Chinese had begun with a brother's addiction and a family's destruction. Pete felt the mood shifting again, but this time not in his favor. Personal tragedy was more powerful than political logic, and Kearney's pain was genuine, even if his solutions were misguided. I've seen what their drugs do to good men, Kearney continued, tears streaming down his weathered face. I've watched my own blood turn into a ghost, a shadow of the man he once was. And you ask me to listen to reason? You ask me to consider their side of the story. Kearney's supporters began to close ranks around their leader, their anger now focused not just on the Chinese community, but on Pete personally. He had become the symbol of everything they feared: foreign intelligence, corrupting influence, and the power to turn their own people against them. Pete realized that he had made a tactical error. By exposing the hypocrisy of Kearney's supporters, he had driven the movement toward its most fanatical core, the people who were beyond rational persuasion and capable of the most extreme violence. As the crowd began to surge toward him, Pete finally drew his revolver, but not to shoot. Instead, he fired 3 shots into the air, the sharp reports echoing off the surrounding buildings like thunder. The gunshots had their intended effect, freezing the crowd in place and creating a moment of tense silence. In that silence, Pete heard something that changed everything. The sound of marching feet approaching from multiple directions. The California National Guard was finally responding to the night's violence, but they weren't coming to restore order between 2 equal combatants. They were coming to protect white citizens from what the newspapers would later describe as a Chinese uprising. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison led the first company of soldiers into Portsmouth Square, his men carrying rifles with fixed bayonets and orders to arrest any Chinese immigrants found outside of designated areas. Harrison was a Civil War veteran who had fought at Gettysburg and Antietam, and he approached the situation in Chinatown with the same mentality that had served him in those earlier battles. Identify the enemy, apply overwhelming force, achieve total victory. Disperse immediately, Harrison shouted through a speaking trumpet. All Chinese persons are to return to their designated quarters. Any Chinese person found on the streets after midnight will be arrested as an enemy combatant. The legal language was crucial. By declaring Chinese immigrants to be enemy combatants rather than American residents, Harrison had stripped them of the constitutional protections that should have applied even to non-citizens on American soil. Pete understood the implications immediately. The night's violence had been transformed from a civil disorder into something approaching martial law, with Chinese Americans designated as an occupied population rather than equal participants in American society. As the soldiers began forming lines to separate the crowd from the Chinese district, Pete made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of continuing to fight or attempting to negotiate with the authorities, he ordered his men to surrender their weapons and return to Chinatown peacefully. "Why?" asked Chen Wei, the young man who had first introduced Robert Whitman to Uncle Fong's establishment years earlier. "We can fight them. We have the numbers now, and the weapons." Pete shook his head, his eyes fixed on the soldiers' bayonets gleaming in the torchlight. "We can fight them tonight and win. But tomorrow there will be more soldiers, and more after that. Tonight we choose between dying as heroes and living as prisoners. But living means we can fight another day." The retreat to Chinatown was humiliating, but strategic. As Pete's men laid down their weapons and submitted to military escort, they appeared to be accepting defeat. But Pete was actually implementing a plan that he had been developing for months. The complete reorganization of Chinese resistance around legal and economic pressure rather than physical force. Over the following weeks, as martial law remained in effect and Chinese immigrants were confined to a 6-block area under military supervision, Pete quietly activated a network that extended far beyond San Francisco. Using coded telegrams and trusted messengers, he coordinated with Chinese communities throughout California, establishing a unified response to what had become a systematic campaign of oppression. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of fighting American authorities directly, Pete organized a comprehensive boycott of white-owned businesses by Chinese consumers and workers. Chinese laundries stopped accepting clothes from white customers. Chinese restaurants closed their doors to non-Chinese patrons. Chinese workers walked off construction sites, leaving major building projects incomplete. Most devastatingly, Chinese merchants stopped purchasing goods from white-owned wholesale businesses, disrupting supply chains that connected San Francisco to markets throughout the Pacific region. Within a week, the city's economy was experiencing what would later be recognized as its first organized labor strike, but one conducted with a sophistication that impressed even Pete's enemies. The economic pressure was immediate and severe. The same businessmen who had publicly supported Kearny's movement found themselves facing financial ruin as their Chinese customers and workers disappeared. Judge Morrison received a delegation of prominent merchants demanding that he find some legal mechanism to force Chinese businesses to reopen. "Your Honor," pleaded Samuel Brannan, whose hardware store had lost 60% of its customers overnight. Surely there must be some law that prevents this kind of economic sabotage. Morrison's response revealed how completely the situation had been transformed by Pete's strategy. Gentlemen, what law requires people to do business with those who have declared them to be enemy combatants? What legal principle forces workers to labor for employers who support their expulsion from the country? The judge's words carried a bitter irony that wasn't lost on his visitors. The same legal system that had been used to oppress Chinese immigrants was now protecting their right to withdraw from economic relationships with their oppressors. But Pete's most effective weapon wasn't economic pressure or legal maneuvering. It was information. During the chaos of the riots, his photographers had documented not just the faces of participants, but the specific acts of violence and property destruction that had occurred. More importantly, they had captured images of police officers and National Guard soldiers participating in or tolerating crimes against Chinese residents. These photographs began appearing in newspapers throughout California and eventually reached national publications, creating a public relations disaster for San Francisco's civic and military leadership. Images of American soldiers standing by while mobs looted Chinese businesses contradicted everything the country claimed to believe about law and order. The most damaging photograph showed Lieutenant Colonel Harrison himself accepting what appeared to be a payment from Dennis Kearney while Chinese buildings burned in the background. The image was actually misleading. Harrison was accepting a telegram from a messenger, not money from Kearney. But the visual impression was devastating. When the photograph appeared on the front page of the New York Tribune under the headline, "American Military Collaborates with Anti-Chinese Mob," the political consequences were immediate. President Rutherford Hayes ordered a federal investigation into the handling of the San Francisco riots, and Harrison found himself facing a court-martial for conduct unbecoming an officer. But the real turning point came when Pete released his most carefully guarded secret: detailed financial records showing the extensive business relationships between prominent white San Franciscans and Chinese merchants. The documents revealed that many of the city's most vocal opponents of Chinese immigration were also their most important business partners. Theodore Whitman, whose son's addiction had sparked the original calls for a crackdown on opium dens, was revealed to be a silent partner in 3 Chinese import businesses. His shipping company had transported over $2 million worth of goods for Chinese merchants over the previous 5 years, earning substantial profits from the very trade he publicly condemned. Dennis Kearney's own hypocrisy was even more spectacular. The labor leader who had built his career on anti-Chinese rhetoric owned stock in 2 companies that employed exclusively Chinese workers, and his family's boarding house had been quietly renting rooms to Chinese immigrants at rates 20% higher than those charged to white tenants. The revelations destroyed Kearney's credibility and fractured his movement. Many of his supporters felt betrayed by the discovery that their leader had been profiting from the very immigration he claimed to oppose. Others began to question whether their economic problems were really caused by Chinese competition or by the corruption of their own leaders. Mickey Sullivan, the dock worker who had saved Uncle Fong during the riots, became the spokesman for a growing number of white workers who were reconsidering their positions. "We've been played for fools," he told a gathering at Murphy's Tavern. "They got us fighting each other while they made money off all of us." Sullivan's transformation was particularly significant because it demonstrated the possibility of cross-racial solidarity among working-class San Franciscans. He began organizing integrated labor unions that included both Chinese and white workers, focusing their anger on exploitative employers rather than competing ethnic groups. But Pete understood that individual conversions like Sullivan's, while important symbolically, weren't enough to secure long-term protection for the Chinese community. What he needed was institutional change, legal precedents that would make it impossible for future demagogues to repeat Kearney's tactics. His opportunity came from an unexpected source: the federal investigation that had been triggered by the photographs of military misconduct. The investigating commission, headed by General Oliver Howard, was genuinely committed to uncovering the truth about what had happened in San Francisco. General Howard was a complex figure, a Union Army veteran who had commanded black troops during the Civil War and had later served as commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau. His experience with racial violence in the post-war South had given him insights into the dynamics of mob action that most of his contemporaries lacked. When Howard arrived in San Francisco in March 1878, he brought with him a team of investigators, stenographers, and legal advisors who were prepared to conduct the kind of thorough examination that the earlier congressional hearings had avoided. Unlike Senator Sargent's politically motivated proceedings, Howard's commission was actually interested in facts rather than predetermined conclusions. The general's first act was to tour Chinatown personally, accompanied only by a Chinese interpreter and a single aide. What he found contradicted everything he had been told about the district by white officials. Instead of the exotic den of vice described by Kearney and others, Howard discovered a community that resembled immigrant neighborhoods throughout American cities. There were families with children, schools and religious institutions, legitimate businesses, and social organizations. The opium dens that had been the focus of so much attention occupied only a few buildings among hundreds of ordinary residences and shops. More importantly, Howard observed something that white San Franciscans had consistently ignored: the evidence of systematic discrimination that forced Chinese immigrants into marginal occupations and substandard living conditions. Legal barriers prevented them from owning property in most areas of the city. Professional licensing requirements excluded them from many trades, and informal boycotts made it difficult for them to establish businesses outside of Chinatown. "Gentlemen," Howard wrote in his preliminary report to Washington, "we have found a community that has been systematically excluded from participation in American economic and social life, then condemned for the poverty and isolation that such exclusion inevitably produces." So, Howard's investigation also uncovered evidence of official corruption that went far beyond what Pete's photographs had revealed. Police Captain Michael Crowley, the nephew of Chief Patrick Crowley, had been collecting protection payments from both legal and illegal Chinese businesses, while simultaneously providing information to anti-Chinese groups planning raids and attacks. The captain's arrest sent shockwaves through San Francisco's political establishment because his detailed records implicated dozens of other officials in similar schemes. What emerged was a picture of systematic exploitation, where Chinese immigrants were forced to pay bribes for basic police protection, while being simultaneously targeted for persecution by the same officials who collected those payments. But Howard's most significant discovery concerned the opium trade itself. Working with Dr. Lai Po Tai and other Chinese medical professionals, the general's team conducted the first scientific study of opium use in San Francisco, and their findings demolished most of the assumptions that had driven anti-Chinese policies. The study revealed that opium addiction rates were actually higher among white Americans than among Chinese immigrants, and that most opium-dependent individuals were not the violent criminals of popular imagination, but functioning members of society who used the drug to manage chronic pain, work-related injuries, or psychological trauma. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a physician who had been treating opium addiction in white patients for over a decade, provided testimony that shattered another cornerstone of anti-Chinese mythology. Standing before Howard's commission in a small conference room overlooking San Francisco Bay, her words carried the weight of professional experience that no political rhetoric could match. "General Howard," Dr. Mitchell began, her voice steady despite the controversial nature of her testimony, "I have treated over 300 cases of opium dependence in my practice. Of these patients, fewer than 30 were Chinese immigrants. The vast majority were white Americans who had become dependent on laudanum prescribed for legitimate medical conditions." She opened a leather medical bag and withdrew a collection of small glass bottles, each bearing the label of a respected San Francisco pharmacy. These contain laudanum preparations that are legally sold throughout the city. The opium content in a single bottle is equivalent to what a moderate user might consume in a Chinese establishment over the course of a month. Howard examined one of the bottles, noting the elegant script that advertised its contents as Dr. Morrison's Miracle Elixir for Nervous Disorders and Female Complaints. The irony of the name wasn't lost on anyone present, given Judge Morrison's own struggles with opium dependence. Dr. Mitchell, Howard asked, in your medical opinion, what accounts for the perception that Chinese opium use represents a greater threat than white laudanum consumption? Her answer was devastating in its simplicity. General, the only significant difference is the method of consumption and the race of the provider. Laudanum is consumed as a liquid medicine prescribed by white doctors to white patients. Opium is smoked in establishments operated by Chinese immigrants. The physiological effects are identical, but the social meanings are completely different. Dr. Mitchell's testimony was supported by Dr. Lai Po Tai, who had compiled his own statistical analysis of addiction patterns in San Francisco. Working together despite the racial barriers that typically prevented such collaboration, the two physicians had created the most comprehensive study of drug use ever conducted in an American city. Their data revealed that addiction knew no racial boundaries, but treatment certainly did. White patients who became dependent on laudanum could seek help from established medical institutions, participate in private treatment programs, and maintain their social respectability throughout their recovery. Chinese immigrants who developed opium problems were criminalized, excluded from medical care, and stigmatized as moral failures. The real crisis, Dr. Lai testified, is not Chinese corruption of American morality, but American refusal to treat addiction as a medical rather than a criminal matter. General Howard's commission also heard testimony from an unexpected witness. Patrick Kearney, Dennis Kearney's younger brother, whose addiction had provided the emotional foundation for the anti-Chinese movement. Patrick had been located in one of Chinatown's smaller opium establishments, but his story revealed truths that his brother had never acknowledged. Patrick Kearney was not the innocent victim of Chinese corruption that Dennis had portrayed. He was a Civil War veteran who had been wounded at the Battle of Chancellorsville, suffering injuries that left him in constant pain for over a decade. Military doctors had prescribed increasing doses of morphine and laudanum, creating a dependence that grew stronger even as his physical wounds healed. When army physicians finally cut off his supply, Patrick had turned to alcohol, but whiskey provided only temporary relief and came with violent side effects that terrified his family. His discovery of opium smoking had actually represented an improvement in his condition, allowing him to manage his pain without the aggression and unpredictability that characterized his drinking. The Chinese didn't corrupt me, Patrick testified, his voice barely above a whisper. They saved me from destroying my family the way the bottle was doing. In those places, I found peace for the first time since the war. His words hung in the air like smoke, challenging everything his brother had built his political career upon. Dennis Kearney, who had been subpoenaed to attend the hearings, sat in stunned silence as his personal tragedy was reframed as a story of Chinese compassion rather than corruption. But Patrick's testimony revealed something even more significant: the extent to which opium establishments served as informal treatment centers for conditions that American medicine was unprepared to address. Veterans suffering from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress, workers dealing with industrial injuries, women coping with the isolation and depression of frontier life, all found in these basement rooms a form of relief that was unavailable anywhere else in the city. Chen Wei, the young man who had first guided Robert Whitman into Uncle Fong's establishment, provided the commission with insights into how these businesses actually operated. Far from the predatory enterprises described by their critics, most opium dens functioned more like informal social clubs where regular customers looked after each other's welfare. "We know our customers," Chen testified through an interpreter. "We know who comes too often, who spends money they cannot afford, who brings problems from the outside world. We try to help them, not harm them." Chen described a complex system of informal rules and mutual support that governed life in the opium establishments. Regular customers who showed signs of serious addiction were encouraged to seek help, often at the establishment's expense. Those who became violent or disruptive were permanently banned. Customers who fell ill were cared for until they recovered or could be returned safely to their families. "This is not a business that profits from destroying people," Chen explained. "Destroyed people cannot pay. We succeed only if our customers remain healthy enough to work, to support their families, to live good lives." The Commission's investigation also uncovered the sophisticated financial networks that connected Chinese businesses to the broader San Francisco economy. Pete's empire, which critics had portrayed as a criminal conspiracy, was revealed to be a complex web of legitimate enterprises that employed thousands of workers and generated substantial tax revenue for the city. Little Pete himself testified before the commission, appearing in an expensive American-style suit and speaking English with only a slight accent. His testimony was a masterpiece of controlled revelation, admitting to certain illegal activities while demonstrating that his operations were fundamentally similar to those of white businessmen who operated outside the law when it served their interests. "Honorable General," Pete said, his manner respectful but not subservient, "you ask about my business activities. I provide services that people want in ways that minimize harm to both customers and community. Is this different from the saloon keeper who sells whiskey knowing it may lead to violence? Is this different from the doctor who prescribes laudanum knowing it may cause dependence?" Pete's most effective moment came when he produced detailed financial records showing his contributions to San Francisco's economy. His various enterprises employed over 800 people, both Chinese and white. His establishments paid more in municipal taxes than most legitimate businesses. His investment in real estate had helped finance the construction of schools, hospitals, and other public facilities. "General Howard," Pete continued, "I am told that I am a threat to American society. But I employ American workers. I pay American taxes. I follow American laws when they apply equally to all people. If I am a threat, it is only to those who profit from keeping Chinese immigrants as a permanent underclass." The Commission's final report, released in September 1878, fundamentally challenged the narrative that had driven anti-Chinese sentiment in California. Howard's team concluded that Chinese immigrants posed no unique threat to American society, that their involvement in the opium trade was primarily a response to systematic exclusion from legitimate economic opportunities, and that the violence directed against them represented a greater threat to American values than their presence in the country. But perhaps most significantly, the report documented how anti-Chinese agitation had been manipulated by powerful economic interests who benefited from racial division among working-class Americans. By encouraging white workers to blame Chinese immigrants for their economic problems, employers had deflected attention from their own role in creating conditions that impoverished all workers, regardless of race. "We have found," Howard wrote in his conclusion, "that the Chinese question is not really about Chinese immigration at all. It is about American willingness to sacrifice constitutional principles and human decency in service of economic and political convenience." The report's recommendations were revolutionary for their time. Equal protection under law for all residents regardless of race, regulation of opium as a medical rather than criminal matter, and federal intervention to prevent local authorities from discriminating against minority populations. But recommendations were one thing, and political reality was another. Even as Howard's commission vindicated Chinese immigrants and exposed the hypocrisy of their critics, powerful forces were already working to ensure that the truth would have little impact on policy. In Washington, Senator Aaron Sargent was collaborating with colleagues from other Western states to draft comprehensive anti-Chinese legislation that would make Howard's recommendations irrelevant. The Chinese Exclusion Act, as it would come to be known, was designed to prohibit Chinese immigration entirely while providing legal justification for the continued persecution of Chinese Americans already in the country. The bill's supporters understood that they needed to act quickly before Howard's findings could influence public opinion or inspire organized resistance. They also knew that success required more than just congressional votes. They needed to create a political climate where opposition to Chinese exclusion would be seen as unpatriotic or economically destructive. Dennis Kearney, despite the personal revelations that had damaged his credibility, remained a valuable ally in this effort. His speeches became even more inflammatory as his movement lost mainstream support, appealing to the most extreme elements of white racial anxiety. "They want us to believe that we're the problem," Kearney declared at a rally in Sacramento. "They want us to think that we're the ones who are un-American because we refuse to accept the yellow invasion of our homeland. But I say that any American who supports Chinese immigration is a traitor to his race and his country." The crowd's response was smaller than in previous years, but more intensely committed. These were true believers who had moved beyond economic grievances to embrace a vision of racial war that would brook no compromise or negotiation. Meanwhile, in San Francisco's Chinatown, little Pete was preparing for what he recognized would be the final battle for Chinese acceptance in America. Howard's investigation had provided him with valuable allies and legal precedents, but Pete understood that political victories could be reversed by legislative action. His strategy evolved from resistance to survival. If Chinese immigrants were going to be excluded from American society, Pete was determined to ensure that they would at least be able to maintain their communities and protect their families during the dark years ahead. Working with Chinese organizations throughout California, Pete began establishing a parallel infrastructure that could function independently of white-controlled institutions. Chinese banks would handle community finances. Chinese schools would educate the next generation. Chinese courts would resolve disputes. And Chinese businesses would create economic opportunities that didn't depend on white customers or suppliers. The Crown and Dragon became the headquarters for this effort, its elegant parlors hosting meetings where Chinese community leaders planned for a future that looked increasingly bleak. The mansion's opium rooms continued to operate, but they now served a different function, providing a neutral space where Chinese and white allies could meet without attracting attention from hostile authorities. Dr. Lipo Tai used his medical practice to create an underground network that could provide healthcare to Chinese immigrants who were being excluded from public hospitals. Mary Chen expanded her school into a comprehensive educational system that could preserve Chinese culture while preparing young people for life in an increasingly hostile environment. Even Uncle Fong, whose modest establishment had been one of the first targets of anti-Chinese violence, played a role in this effort. His basement den became a communications center where information could be passed between different Chinese communities, coded messages hidden in seemingly innocent conversations between customers. But Pete's most important ally was someone whose support surprised everyone who knew the history of conflict between their communities: Mickey Sullivan, the Irish dock worker who had saved Uncle Fong during the riots. Sullivan had used his credibility among white workers to organize a multiracial labor union that challenged both employer exploitation and racial division among employees. His speeches at Murphy's Tavern now focused on class solidarity rather than ethnic conflict. "The bosses want us fighting each other," Sullivan told a mixed crowd of Irish, German, Italian, and Chinese workers. "They want us blaming the Chinese for low wages instead of blaming the men who set those wages. They want us attacking each other instead of organizing together." Sullivan's transformation was remarkable, not just for its political significance, but for what it revealed about the possibility of overcoming racial hatred through shared struggle. His alliance with Chinese workers began as a practical matter. They faced common enemies and common problems, but it evolved into genuine friendship and mutual respect. The collaboration between Sullivan and Pete became a model for other cross-racial alliances, demonstrating that cooperation was possible even between communities that had been taught to see each other as enemies. Their success in organizing integrated strikes and boycotts showed that working-class solidarity could overcome ethnic divisions when people focused on their shared interests rather than their cultural differences. But these encouraging developments were overshadowed by the larger political forces moving against Chinese Americans throughout the country. By early 1879, it was clear that some form of exclusion legislation would pass Congress, and the only question was how comprehensive and punitive it would be. Pete made a decision that would define his legacy. Rather couldn't win, he would focus on protecting than fighting a battle the Chinese Americans who would remain in the country after exclusion became law. This meant accepting the reality of legal discrimination while creating structures that could help his community survive and eventually thrive despite official hostility. The spring of 1879 brought news that changed everything. Robert Whitman, the young heir whose disappearance into opium addiction had sparked the original crackdown on Chinese establishments, walked into his father's shipping office after an absence of nearly 4 years. Theodore Whitman barely recognized his son. The pampered young man who had fled into Chinatown's opium dens had been transformed into someone harder, more focused, more mature. Robert's eyes were clear, his bearing confident, his manner suggesting someone who had found peace with himself and his place in the world. "Father," Robert said simply, "we need to talk." What followed was a conversation that neither man had expected to have. Robert had not spent the previous 4 years lost in narcotic dreams, as his father had assumed. Instead, he had used his time in Chinatown to learn Chinese language and culture, to study business practices that had allowed immigrants to succeed despite systematic discrimination, and to develop skills that would serve him well in the international trade that was becoming central to San Francisco's economy. "I know you've been looking for me," Robert continued, his voice calm but firm. "I know you've blamed the Chinese for corrupting me, for stealing me from our family. But they didn't steal me, Father. They saved me." Theodore Whitman listened in stunned silence as his son described a different version of the story that had driven him to seek vengeance against the Chinese community. Robert's addiction had been real, but it had been a symptom of deeper problems rather than the cause of his disappearance from respectable society. "I was drowning in expectations I couldn't meet," Robert explained. "I was trying to be the son you wanted instead of the man I was meant to become." The laudanum numbed the pain temporarily, but it was the Chinese community that taught me how to live with myself. Robert described years of working in legitimate Chinese businesses, learning languages and trading practices that had given him skills his Harvard education had never provided. He had traveled to Hong Kong and Shanghai as a representative of Chinese merchants, establishing relationships that could benefit both Chinese and American businesses. Most importantly, he had learned to see Chinese immigrants not as exotic foreigners or dangerous competitors, but as people whose experiences had taught them valuable lessons about survival, adaptation, and success in hostile environments. "Father," Robert said, reaching into his coat pocket, "I have a proposal for you." What Robert withdrew was a business plan for a joint venture that would combine his father's shipping connections with Chinese trading networks, creating opportunities that neither community could achieve alone. The proposal was detailed, professionally prepared, and potentially extremely profitable. Theodore Whitman studied the documents with the eye of an experienced businessman, and what he saw impressed him despite his prejudices. The plan demonstrated sophisticated understanding of international markets, currency fluctuations, and regulatory requirements. More importantly, it offered a path toward rebuilding the relationship with his son that he had feared was lost forever. But accepting Robert's proposal would require Theodore to acknowledge that everything he had believed about Chinese immigrants was wrong, that his campaign against them had been based on misunderstanding and misplaced anger. It would mean admitting that the people he had tried to destroy had actually helped his son become a better man than he might have been otherwise. The decision Theodore Whitman made in his oak-paneled office that spring morning would ripple through San Francisco's business community and ultimately influence the broader relationship between Chinese and white Americans on the West Coast. His choice would demonstrate whether personal relationships could overcome political prejudices, whether economic interests could triumph over racial hatred. As father and son sat across from each other in the gathering dusk, the fog beginning to roll in from the Pacific, as it had every evening for countless years, they represented more than just a family reunion. They embodied the possibility that Americans could move beyond the fears and divisions that had poisoned their society, toward a future where different communities could coexist and prosper together. But outside their private conversation, larger forces were still moving toward a confrontation that would test whether America was truly committed to the principles of equality and justice it claimed to represent. The Chinese Exclusion Act was making its way through Congress. Dennis Kearney's movement was planning new campaigns of violence and intimidation. And throughout California, Chinese Americans were preparing for a future that looked increasingly uncertain. In the basement establishments where it all began, where desperate people had once sought temporary escape from impossible circumstances, the oil lamps still flickered in the gathering darkness. But the conversations taking place around those flames had changed from dreams of individual relief to plans for collective survival. The opium dens that had been portrayed as symbols of foreign corruption were quietly transforming into community centers where Chinese Americans planned their resistance to exclusion, where they developed strategies for maintaining their culture and protecting their families in an increasingly hostile land. Uncle Fong, now in his 70s, still prepared pipes with the same ceremonial precision he had learned decades earlier in Canton. But his customers were no longer seeking escape from their American dreams. They were planning how to make those dreams survive the nightmare that was about to descend upon their community. The sweet smoke that rose from bamboo pipes in those hidden rooms now carried not just the hopes and fears of individual users, but the collective aspirations of an entire people who had traveled thousands of miles seeking freedom, only to discover that freedom in America came with conditions they had never imagined. As 1879 drew to a close, the stage was set for the final act in this drama of immigration, addiction, and American identity. The choices made in the coming months would determine not just the fate of Chinese Americans, but the meaning of American democracy itself. In the shadows of Chinatown, where gaslight struggled against the eternal fog, the future of a nation's soul hung in the balance like smoke from a dying pipe, beautiful and ephemeral, carrying within its tendrils both the promise of dreams fulfilled and the bitter taste of promises broken. The story that had begun with individual desperation was about to become a chapter in the larger American story, a test of whether a nation built on principles of equality and opportunity could live up to those ideals when faced with people who looked different, spoke different languages, and sought the same dreams through different means. The year 1880 dawned with an ominous silence hanging over San Francisco's fog-shrouded streets. The Chinese Exclusion Act had passed Congress just months earlier, and its effects were already rippling through the city like cracks in a foundation. But in the narrow alleyways of Chinatown, where red lanterns still cast their crimson glow onto rain-slick cobblestones, a different kind of transformation was taking place. Little Pete stood at the window of the Crown and Dragon, watching as the last of his white customers hurried away into the night. The elegant mansion that had once hosted railroad barons and shipping magnates now served a very different purpose. The Persian carpets remained, the crystal lamps still gleamed, but the conversations taking place in those silk-draped rooms were no longer about temporary escape from personal demons. They were about permanent survival in a country that had officially declared Chinese immigrants unwelcome. The change had been gradual at first. In the months following General Howard's investigation, many of Pete's wealthy white patrons had simply stopped coming. Some feared political repercussions if their associations with Chinese establishments became public. Others found that the social dynamics had shifted too dramatically for comfortable drug use. How could you lose yourself in narcotic dreams alongside people your government had labelled as enemies of the state? But the transformation went deeper than lost customers or changed social dynamics. The very nature of what these establishments represented had evolved. Where once they had been refugees from individual pain, they were becoming fortresses against collective persecution. Chen Wei, now a man in his 30s with graying temples and worry lines around his eyes, had become Pete's lieutenant in this new phase of their organization. His role had expanded far beyond guiding nervous customers to basement dens. He now coordinated a network of safe houses, message relays, and financial transfers that kept the Chinese community functioning as American institutions grew increasingly hostile. On this particular evening, Chen Wei brought news that would change everything once again. "Uncle Fong is dead," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of rain against the mansion's tall windows. Pete felt something cold settle in his chest. Uncle Fong had been more than just another opium den proprietor. He had been a bridge between the old world and the new, a man who had maintained dignity and compassion even in the face of systematic persecution. His modest establishment had served not just as a business, but as an informal embassy where Chinese immigrants could find counsel, support, and connection to their cultural roots. "How?" Pete asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "3 white men," Chen Wei replied. "They came to his place last night demanding money, claiming he owed taxes on his business license. When he showed them the receipts proving he had already paid, they said the payments weren't valid because they had been made to Chinese officials rather than American ones." The logic was circular and cruel, but it reflected the new legal reality facing Chinese immigrants. Even the most basic transactions were being challenged if they involved Chinese intermediaries, creating impossible situations where compliance with the law became literally impossible. Uncle Fong tried to explain, Chen Wei continued, his voice growing harder. He showed them all his documents, all his permits. But they weren't interested in documents. They wanted him to admit that he was operating illegally so they could seize his property. Pete could picture the scene. The elderly proprietor facing down 3 men half his age, armed with nothing but his dignity and his faith in American justice. It would have been a hopeless confrontation from the beginning. When he refused to confess to crimes he hadn't committed, they beat him with clubs until he couldn't stand. Then they set fire to his establishment with him still inside. The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and suffocating. Uncle Fong's death wasn't just murder. It was a message to every Chinese immigrant in San Francisco. Your lives have no value. Your rights have no protection. Your presence in America exists only at the sufferance of those who consider you less than human. But Pete had learned something important during his years building his empire. Grief was a luxury that leaders couldn't afford. There would be time to mourn Uncle Fong later. Tonight, there were practical matters to address. "Where is the body?" Pete asked. "The fire department wouldn't let us retrieve it," Chen Wei replied bitterly. "They said the building was too dangerous, that it might collapse, but they let the white men who killed him walk away without even questioning them." This was the new reality of Chinese life in America. Not only were they denied equal protection under the law, they were denied even the basic human dignity of burying their dead according to their cultural traditions. Pete walked to his desk and withdrew a leather-bound ledger, the same kind of detailed record-keeping that had made his business empire so successful. But this ledger contained different information: names, addresses, and detailed descriptions of every act of violence committed against Chinese residents since the Exclusion Act had passed. "Add Uncle Fong's name to the list," Pete instructed, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. "Include the names of his killers if we can identify them." Chen Wei looked puzzled. "What good will that do? The police won't investigate and the courts won't prosecute. These men will never face justice for what they've done." Pete's smile was cold and calculating. "Justice takes many forms, my friend. American justice may have failed, But that doesn't mean justice itself is impossible. Over the following weeks, the three men who had killed Uncle Fong began experiencing a series of unfortunate incidents. James Crawford, a dock worker who had led the attack, found that his employer suddenly questioned his honesty after receiving anonymous reports of theft. Thomas Murphy, a small-time merchant, discovered that his suppliers were no longer willing to extend credit after hearing rumors about his business practices. William Stevens, a city clerk, learned that his superiors had received detailed documentation of bribes he had accepted from various sources. None of these men could prove that their troubles were connected to Uncle Fong's murder, but they understood the message perfectly. Pete's network extended far beyond Chinatown, reaching into every level of San Francisco's economy and politics. He couldn't use American law to punish Uncle Fong's killers, but he could make their lives increasingly difficult until they chose to leave the city entirely. This was Pete's new strategy for protecting his community: economic and social pressure applied with surgical precision to make persecution costly for those who engaged in it. He couldn't prevent all violence against Chinese immigrants, but he could ensure that such violence came with consequences that American authorities were unwilling to impose. The strategy was working, but it came at a terrible cost. Pete's organization was transforming from a business empire into something resembling a shadow government, complete with its own intelligence network, enforcement mechanisms, and system of justice. The Chinese community was achieving a form of security, but only by separating itself ever more completely from American society. Mary Chen understood this dilemma better than most. Her school had grown into a comprehensive educational system serving over 300 Chinese children, but it operated entirely in isolation from San Francisco's public schools. Her students were receiving excellent educations, learning both Chinese and English, studying both traditional culture and modern subjects. But they were also learning to see themselves as fundamentally separate from American society, as people who could never truly belong in the country of their birth. "We're creating our own nation within a nation," Mary confided to Dr. Lai Po-tai during one of their regular consultations about community health issues. "Our children are growing up as Americans in every way except legally and socially. What kind of future are we preparing them for?" Dr. Lai had been struggling with similar questions in his medical practice. As American hospitals and clinics increasingly refused to treat Chinese patients, he had been forced to establish a complete parallel healthcare system. His small office had expanded into a full medical facility with surgical capabilities, pharmacy services, and specialized treatments that rivaled anything available in the white medical community. "Perhaps," Dr. Lai replied thoughtfully, "we are preparing them for a different kind of American future. One where multiple communities can coexist without one dominating the others." It was an optimistic interpretation of their circumstances, but both Mary and Dr. Lai knew that the reality was more complex and potentially more tragic. The Chinese community was achieving remarkable things in isolation, but isolation itself was a form of defeat. The promise of American democracy was supposed to be inclusion, not separation. Meanwhile, the physical landscape of Chinatown was changing in ways that reflected this new reality. The opium dens that had once catered to mixed clientele were being transformed into exclusively Chinese spaces. The Crown and Dragon's elegant parlors now hosted meetings of the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, the unofficial governing body that Pete had helped establish to coordinate community affairs. But the basement rooms where opium was still consumed served a different function than they had in earlier years. The customers were no longer seeking escape from individual problems, but temporary relief from collective trauma. The violence, discrimination, and constant uncertainty of Chinese life in America had created a form of community-wide psychological damage that traditional medicine was ill-equipped to address. Uncle Fong's old establishment, rebuilt after the fire that claimed his life, had become a memorial of sorts. The new proprietor, a nephew who had inherited the business, maintained a small shrine in the corner where the old man had died. Customers would often pause before the shrine, offering brief prayers or moments of silence before settling onto the wooden bunks. The ritual of opium preparation remained unchanged, but its meaning had evolved. What had once been an individual pursuit of chemical relief had become a form of collective meditation, a shared acknowledgement of suffering that bound the community together in ways that transcended cultural or economic differences. Chen Wei often visited the rebuilt establishment, not as Pete's lieutenant coordinating resistance activities, but simply as a man seeking connection to something larger than his daily struggles. As he lay on one of the wooden bunks, drawing slowly on a bamboo pipe, he would remember Uncle Fong's gentle hands preparing the drug with ceremonial precision, the old man's quiet wisdom, his unwavering belief that human dignity could survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it. These memories were becoming more important as the original generation of Chinese immigrants began to die off, taking with them irreplaceable knowledge about the community's history and traditions. Uncle Fong's death had been particularly devastating because he had served as an informal historian, maintaining oral records of who had arrived when, which families had succeeded or failed, what lessons had been learned through decades of struggle. The loss of this institutional memory was creating a sense of urgency among community leaders. Pete began organizing systematic efforts to document Chinese San Francisco's history, interviewing elderly immigrants, collecting photographs and documents, creating written records that could preserve essential information for future generations. This project revealed just how remarkable the Chinese community's achievements had been. Despite systematic exclusion from most economic opportunities, Chinese immigrants had created a parallel economy that generated millions of dollars in annual revenue. They had established schools that achieved higher literacy rates than many public institutions. They had built healthcare systems that served not only Chinese residents, but also white customers who found Chinese medical treatments more effective than Western alternatives. The opium trade, which had been portrayed as evidence of Chinese moral degradation, was revealed in this larger context as just one element of a comprehensive community response to systematic persecution. Chinese immigrants had created institutions to address every human need that American society refused to meet: healthcare, education, financial services, legal assistance, social support, and yes, even chemical relief from unbearable circumstances. But documenting these achievements also revealed their fragility. The entire structure of Chinese institutional life in San Francisco depended on a delicate balance of economic relationships, political accommodations, and social arrangements that could be disrupted by changes in American law or shifts in public opinion. The Chinese Exclusion Act had already begun this process of disruption. By prohibiting new immigration and making it nearly impossible for Chinese residents to bring family members to America, the law was gradually reducing the community's population and economic base. Businesses that had depended on steady streams of new workers and customers were struggling to survive. Families were being separated permanently. Cultural traditions that required critical masses of practitioners were beginning to disappear. Pete understood that his community was fighting not just for acceptance in American society, but for survival as a distinct culture. The strategies that had worked during the 1870s, building economic leverage, cultivating political relationships, demonstrating respectability, were no longer sufficient in the face of systematic legal exclusion. What was needed was a fundamentally different approach, one that focused on preservation rather than integration, on cultural autonomy rather than assimilation. This meant accepting that Chinese Americans might never achieve full equality in American society, but ensuring that they could maintain their identity and traditions despite official hostility. The transformation of the opium establishments was emblematic of this broader shift in strategy. These spaces were becoming cultural preservation centers where Chinese languages, customs, and values could be maintained and transmitted to younger generations. The drug use continued, but it was now embedded in a larger framework of community solidarity and cultural continuity. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the white physician who had testified before General Howard's commission, found herself drawn into this evolving situation in ways she had never expected. As American medical institutions increasingly excluded Chinese patients, Dr. Mitchell had begun collaborating more closely with Dr. Lai Po Tai, sharing knowledge and resources that benefited both communities. Their partnership had produced remarkable innovations in addiction treatment, combining Western medical techniques with traditional Chinese approaches to create more effective therapies than either culture had developed independently. But their work was becoming increasingly difficult as racial tensions made cooperation between white and Chinese professionals politically dangerous. "We're losing something precious," Dr. Mitchell confided to Dr. Lay during one of their clandestine meetings in the Crown and Dragon's medical suite. "The knowledge we've developed together, the treatments we've created, the understanding we've gained about human nature and healing, none of it will survive if our communities continue to separate." Dr. Lai nodded sadly. "In China, we have a saying, when the small fish fight, the big fish eat them both. Americans and Chinese are both small fish in the larger ocean of human ignorance and suffering. But instead of swimming together, we are being forced to fight each other." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor, Robert Whitman, who had become a regular presence at community meetings as his business partnership with his father had evolved into a broader commitment to Chinese-American cooperation. Robert brought news that would change the trajectory of everything they had been working toward. "The federal government is planning new restrictions," he announced, his face grave. "Not just immigration limits, but residency requirements that could force Chinese Americans to register with local authorities, carry identity papers, submit to regular inspections. The proposed regulations would essentially create a system of internal passports for Chinese Americans, making them subject to constant surveillance and harassment by government officials. It was a level of systematic oppression that went beyond exclusion to approach something resembling occupation." Pete listened to Robert's report with the calculating attention he had learned to apply to all potentially threatening information. "How long do we have before these regulations take effect?" 6 months, maybe less," Robert replied. "My father's political contacts suggest that the legislation will pass easily. There's no organized opposition, and most Americans see this as a reasonable extension of existing exclusion policies." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. 6 months to prepare for a level of persecution that would make their current difficulties seem mild by comparison. 6 months to decide whether to submit to systematic dehumanization or find some other path forward. Chen Wei was the first to speak. "We could leave. Move to other cities, other states where the enforcement might be less strict." But Pete shook his head. "Running away just delays the inevitable. These laws will spread throughout the country. If we don't make a stand here, where we're strongest, we'll never be able to make a stand anywhere." Mary Chen had a different concern. "What about the children? The ones who were born here, who are American citizens by birth? Will they be subject to these same restrictions?" Robert's answer was devastating. The legislation makes no distinction between immigrants and native-born Chinese Americans. In the government's view, race trumps citizenship. This revelation struck at the heart of everything the Chinese community had been working toward. The children in Mary's schools, the patients in Dr. Lai's clinics, the young people who had grown up thinking of themselves as Americans, all would be subject to the same systematic oppression as recent immigrants who had never claimed American identity. The fog still rolls in over San Francisco every evening, just as it did in 1880, carrying with it the ghosts of dreams deferred and promises broken. In those narrow alleyways where red lanterns once beckoned desperate souls seeking escape, the shadows remember stories that history books prefer to forget. Uncle Fong's gentle hands preparing ceremonial pipes, Little Pete's calculating eyes watching America's contradictions unfold. Robert Whitman discovering that salvation, sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. These weren't just stories about opium, or immigration, or racial hatred. They were stories about what happens when a nation's ideals collide with its deepest fears, when the promise of equality meets the reality of human prejudice. The Chinese Exclusion Act would remain in effect for over 60 years, but in those smoke-filled basement rooms, something more enduring had been created. Proof that dignity can survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it, that communities can endure even when nations reject them, and that the American dream, however imperfect, continues to call to those brave enough to pursue it through the shadows.